Our 100th episode is coming up on March 12th, and we're doing a giveaway.
Yes, and to enter, go ahead on the giveaway post, tag 3 friends who aren't already following us, and then if you want to enter a second time for a bonus entry for this giveaway, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then send us a direct message with your YouTube username so we can keep track and enter you in for that bonus entry.
Yeah, for third place, we're going to be giving away a coffee gift card and stickers. For second place, we're going to give away third place prize plus a CC&C mug and t-shirt. And then for first place, we're going to give away all of that plus a pour-over machine made by our friend Matthew that has our logo on it and a coffee hangout with me, you, and Tyler. Make sure you go and you enter for this great contest.
Yes, you don't want to miss it.
We'll be announcing the winner on the 100th episode on March 12th. Hi, welcome to Christ Culture and Coffee. I'm Robbie Lashwell. I'm here with my co-host, Tyler Hurley.
Yes, finally back.
Man. It's good to see you.
It's good, it's good. Super excited for today. Another special guest interview today. We are very excited.
It's going to be awesome. Today, we have my friend James Umber here. James and I go way back because we've been speaking at conferences, the Deep Faith conferences we've been doing. You are also is it called a chapter director?
Chapter director, yeah.
Dude, you are really important.
Yeah, sounds really important. Totally not, but it sounds really important.
No, but a chapter director with Ratio Christi at the ASU Tempe campus. Now, for those of you who aren't from Arizona, that's the main campus. And ASU, it's one of the 2 largest universities in the state, right?
Definitely. It's the largest in the state. Yeah,
but it's maybe one of the 2 largest in the country.
Yeah, it's in the top 6, I think.
6, okay, nice.
So I think there are about 50,000 students on campus.
Holy
cow.
It's
like a city. I mean, really.
That's huge. Sorry, Duke, eat your heart out. You got nothing.
Yeah, right.
You're too small. Ohio State's pretty big, though, I guess.
Yeah.
So, that's awesome, man. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Ratio Christi and what you do down at ASU?
I'd be happy to. So, Ratio Christi is a Latin phrase. You know, that might sound kind of strange, Ratio Christi, but it simply means the reason of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so, what we do is, I should give some background. So, Ratio Christi originally started in 2007 by a group of students who were responding on their campus to the new atheist movement.
Oh, okay.
And so they said, we need to have some reasons. We need to talk about the reasons why we believe what we believe. And so that chapter then grew, and so now we have chapters on almost 200 university campuses around the world, and
That's
college
crazy.
And university campuses.
200?
Yeah, and so mostly in the United States, but there are a few chapters even in other countries. And so now we have a chapter there at ASU Tempe, and so it's been going great. It's been awesome. Basically, what we do is we help the believing students understand why they can believe what they believe, why they can believe in Christianity. And so we study the evidence for Christianity, but we also help the non-believing students, the skeptics, including skeptical, not only students, but also professors, find answers to their doubts and their questions.
That's awesome.
And so because of that, our ministry is not like an alternative to the other Christian ministries on campus. You know, there are some great Christian ministries on the ASU campus, and so we partner with those ministries on campus. And so as we help strengthen the beliefs of the believing students, the followers of Christ on campus, and as we help draw unbelievers to Christ, we then point those students to the other ministries on campus.
Plugged in.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
And to the local churches as well.
That's so cool, man. I think everything I've ever known or heard of about Ratio Christi is just awesome. From on our Instagram, we follow a ton of Ratio Christi groups all over the country, and it's just really cool to see what you guys are doing and how it's going. I mean, people are coming to know that Christianity is viable and that there's good evidence for it. So yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing down at Arizona State. That's really cool. Yeah,
it's been awesome.
Well, one of the things, James, and this is very important, we always ask people when they come on our show, do you like coffee? And if so, which we pray to God you do, what type of coffee do you like? So question number 1, James Umber, Chapter Director, Ratio Christi, ASU. Do you like coffee?
No, I mean yes. I mean yes.
Oh, good.
That was a
good,
close one.
good.
I know. So I love coffee. It helps me get going in the morning.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I started a few years ago doing cold brew coffee, and so we make our cold brew. Brews for 24 hours in the refrigerator, and then it's. That way we can heat it up if we want it hot.
Yeah.
We can pour it over ice and have cold coffee. So in the summers in Arizona, man, that helps
It's
a lot.
115
So
out.
we-
Cold coffee is
Now,
really nice.
I'd like to say that I'm, a connoisseur and I drink it black. That's not true. I do put a splash of milk in there. So I think, actually, I should say it's more than a splash. So it comes out concentrated, right?
Yeah.
So we usually add, we do half a cup of the cold brew concentrate and then half a cup of water.
Okay.
So it's pretty watered down, but it actually comes out tasting like,
well, it's so
drip-
concentrated.
Yeah, exactly. And then half a cup of milk, and then we add a little bit of Torani, like a splash of Torani.
nice.
in there.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's really good. One of with cold brew, and you can't do it a lot because it's so rich. But I love throwing sweetened condensed milk in. Have you ever done that?
Yeah.
It makes it's so good. It has a totally different flavor to it. So
That's good.
That's awesome, man. Well, I'm very thankful that you like coffee.
Yeah, especially too since we gave you some coffee. I was a little nervous. I'm like,
you
well,
know.
if the answer was no, then yikes.
I just dumped it out. There's a
water
puddle
in there,
of it.
yeah.
There we go.
back
Oh,
here.
gotcha.
Yeah. No, just
Whatever.
You gave it to the plant next to you.
Yeah, exactly. The plant.
Yeah.
I hope you aren't too attached to that plant.
No, we're not. I think it's plastic.
Probably.
So I think we'll be all right. Awesome. Cool, man. Well, we really are glad you're here. And one of the reasons we asked you to come, and one of the reasons I've wanted to have you on the show for a while, is because you are really, really intelligent about evolution and science when it comes to apologetics. And that's definitely something that Tyler and I were not really that good at, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a
We
very
haven't studied
interesting
it a ton. Yeah, and there's so much depth to it. And man, you've really taken a ton of time. I've heard you at conferences speak on it, and I'm like, man, if we want to get somebody, I could study and I could do a subpar job, or we could get James to come on and just do an awesome job. And so we're really thankful you're here to talk about, evolution and intelligent design.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when you're at Ratio Christi and you're doing like these ask me anything question times at the mall, do you get a lot of questions about evolution, or is it about other stuff?
It's a mix. I mean, it's all over the map, but certainly we have had several students come up and ask questions about evolution because they think this is, and by the way, when I say evolution, mainly I'm talking about Darwinian evolution, what's often referred to as Darwinism, this idea that it's a theory that explains where all of life came from, right? And so that grand theory, they think this is an open and shut case. I mean, we know this is a fact. And they say, well, in all of my classes, especially the majors, the people who've been majoring in a science, they say, in all my classes, we know that this is a proven fact. And so, it just seems ridiculous for someone to actually question it. It's like questioning whether, the Earth is round or questioning whether the Earth goes around the sun.
That's what it sounds like to them, right?
That's what
It's
it sounds like to
insane,
them, just ridiculous. And so, this question comes up quite a bit.
That's awesome. Well, you are the guy. You're prepared. You've got the evidence.
My reputation exceeds me.
Yeah, it does. It really does. Yeah, this is awesome. So, all right, well, let's start with just defining terms a little bit, right? Yeah. So when we're talking about evolution, there's a difference between microevolution and macroevolution. And we even had Darwin kind of tried to prove macro through showing micro, right? Which is, I kind of think, I used to do magic tricks and stuff, so I always think that's like a little sleight of hand. Like, that's not fair. They're different categories. So can you explain a little about what's microevolution versus macroevolution?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important to make that distinction because often these are mixed up. Microevolution is the idea that you have these small adaptations within a genus, let's say. So now, typically, when we think of the major types of animals, we tend to think of species, but really the word species is really ambiguous. It's not very clear exactly what a species is. There are a bunch of different definitions of the word species. Okay. So I would say instead I would go up a level to genus or maybe family, that kind of thing. But these are small adaptations within that type, within that group is the idea. So we're not talking about one type of organism changing into another type of organism, but instead we're just talking about small adaptations within that group. Okay. So kind of a theoretical example, sort of a thought experiment that you often hear is if you have these little fluffy bunnies, right? You've got these bunnies and you've got white bunnies and you've got brown bunnies. If you're in an environment where, let's say, snow has become more common, the winters are lasting longer, and so now the environment is mainly snow, those white bunnies are going to be very happy because they're going to blend in really well, right?
Yeah.
And so now the predators are going to be picking off the brown bunnies. The brown bunnies are goners, right?
Yeah.
And so
they can't hide anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So they're going to stand out like a sore thumb. So now you have adaptation in the sense that now most of the bunnies are going to be these white bunnies.
Okay.
A real world example is the Galapagos finches. Many people have heard of the Galapagos finches. And Darwin had taken note of these finches on the Galapagos Islands. And in the mid to late 1970s, there were a group of researchers that visited the Galapagos Islands. And they noticed that during a drought, they noticed that typically the finches had a variety of beak sizes. Some had these small, thin beaks that are better for eating soft, small seeds. And some had these thick, large, thick beaks. They were better for eating the large, dry seeds. Well, they noticed when there's a drought, the finches with the small, thin beaks would really die out because they didn't have as much food that they could eat.
Makes sense.
And the finches with the large, thick beaks dominated the islands. And so, so here you have another example of adaptation, but none of this explains where the finch originally came from, or even where the trait for small, thin beaks or the trait for large, thick beaks, where that originally came from.
It's just showing adaptation within a species.
Right.
And we see that all over the place.
Yeah.
With, I mean, with there's different types of dogs, right?
Right.
And we can breed them certain ways and everything, but that's just adaptation. It's not changing genus or changing family.
Right, which is why this is not controversial at all.
It's just kind of common knowledge.
Yeah, it's not
everyone
disputed.
Knows it,
I don't know of a single creation scientist that actually doubts whether microevolution happens all the time.
Yeah.
And it's because, like you said, we observe it all the time.
Yeah, in pretty much every species. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, sure. That's awesome.
Right.
Okay, so macro, that's micro.
That's micro, yeah.
Micro, which we would have no problem with.
Right, yeah, I totally acknowledge microevolution. That's important, and that's an important contribution that Darwin made to biology. But macroevolution instead are these large-scale changes. Okay. So this is like a fish becoming a reptile, or at least some kind of four-legged land animal, or reptiles turning into birds, or land animals turning into whales, or even primates turning into humans. Here we're talking about large-scale changes, and these are the kind of changes that you need to demonstrate in order to demonstrate Darwinism.
Okay.
If we're going to actually demonstrate that Darwinism is the best explanation, then we need to find examples, and we need to demonstrate. Well, first of all, we need to demonstrate that it's possible for let's say a fish to become a tetrapod, a four-legged, land walking animal. We also need to show that those kinds of changes are possible. And then we also need to show that those happened in the history of life on Earth.
So that's two things.
Yes.
Not just that it's possible, but that it did in fact happen. Because a lot of things are possible.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And really that distinction between micro and macro evolution is not just some distinction made up by creation scientists. Mainstream Darwinian biologists have for a long time acknowledged the difference between micro and macro evolution. But the question is, can micro evolutionary changes become macroevolutionary changes? And really, that's the core question. And we could talk about that some more if you want. But that's the main issue.
Yeah, because you get into like what I've seen with this argument is you're trying to make micro put macro on its back as well. We've seen this happen.
Yeah, you see that a lot.
We have a theory about this, and micro is just too small to carry the weight
right,
of the macroevolution argument because there isn't evidence for it. Yeah. I mean, the reason, and we're going to get into the evidence for or against evolution, but the reason I don't believe in evolution is because I don't find any evidence for it. Macroevolution.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't see it. Everything I've looked at, it seems like intelligent design is more of more evidence-based. Like there's way more evidence for it. It makes way more sense in how the world is. So, it seems like they're really putting a lot on microevolution to back this up, right? And that's what Darwin did with the finches and everything.
Right. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, let's get into a little bit of, all right, what do you think are some issues with microevolution? And this is, I think, an important distinction, or with macroevolution.
Macroevolution,
I think this is an important distinction for us because when we're talking with an atheist, which you do often at ASU, you're talking with a skeptic, they don't really care too much about what the Bible says.
Right, yeah.
And so how can we, without using the Bible, give evidence that we don't really think evolution holds water? Right. Macroevolution. So excluding the Bible, right? I've seen this mistake. I'm sure you've seen it too, where Christians, somebody will come out and say, "Why do you think evolution didn't happen?" And they pull out their Bible, and it's like, I don't think the Bible's authoritative.
Yeah, exactly.
So
for the average person, I think, and especially in a secular environment, I think when you pull out the Bible, it's like pulling out Aesop's fables and saying, "Well, let me read you some passages." I mean, to them, it's basically the same thing.
Yeah, it's nonsense to people who don't believe in it. Sure. Right. So it's not an authority. So what is an authority, and what can we show them to say this is why we don't believe in it?
Yeah, so I think pointing to the scientific evidence becomes really critical, especially when we're talking to secular, people who don't believe in Christianity, don't have, especially many people don't even have a Christian background, which is amazing. So I would say that what we need to show is that that the theory that best explains what we observe would be intelligent design rather than evolution. I think we need to show that Darwinism does not best explain what we observe. And so I think when we look at the evidence, we find that Darwinism fails to explain what we really observe in the biological sciences. Okay. So for example, the fossil record, I think, is a great example of where we see this. The fossil record doesn't fit the pattern that evolution would predict, that Darwinian evolution would predict. If evolution is true, we should find evidence that all of life is related to a common ancestor. So not only would we expect to find fossils of like insects and fish and reptiles and so on, but we would also expect to find millions of transitions between all these different groups.
Yeah, like a half fish, half bird,
the
half
link,
half
right?
reptile thing.
Exactly. And so we would expect to find like a tree of life pattern like Darwin talked about, where they're all connected.
Yeah.
And this tree of life should have branches connecting all the different organisms, both living and extinct. So, I mean, think about all the different types of organisms on Earth today. I don't know if you've seen one of those, like one of the not abridged encyclopedias of animals and all the different types of organisms on Earth.
I haven't seen one.
Really, you'd need multiple volumes to even come close. So those are the ones that are living. Now add in the ones that are extinct, which would be even more than you have living today. Right. So this is a huge tree. Usually when you see these more accurately depicted, it doesn't even really look like a tree. It looks more like a point in the middle and then branches going in all directions, because one direction is just too many. It doesn't all fit, So in order to fit all the branches, you have to like wrap around the whole origin of life there in the middle. So and keep in mind that each of these connecting branches represents millions and millions of years of slow, gradual change. So the number of transitions ought to be countless.
We should find them in the fossil record, right?
And that's what Darwin said.
That's what he said. Yeah, if it's these small progressive adaptations over a ton of time, we should find we should find fossils in each stage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so Darwin said in Origin of Species, he said, quote, "The number of intermediate and transitional links between all living and extinct species must have been inconceivably great." So, but he also said, by this theory, countless transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth? Yeah. So it turns out the fossil record was a real problem for Darwin, and I think it's actually a bigger problem today. And so we could talk about how actually the field of paleontology, the study of fossils, has actually made the problem worse.
Right.
Yeah. Well, is that because we have more fossil evidence today than Darwin did in the 1800s.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Really, the field of paleontology has exploded since the 1850s, and so now today the problem is even worse. Yeah. So, like for example, the paleontologist Dr. David Raup, he said in 1979, he said, "quote Darwin was embarrassed by the fossil record. We're now about 120 years after Darwin, and our knowledge of the fossil record has greatly expanded. We now have over 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. In fact, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transitions than we had in Darwin's time."
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, right? So the fossil record kind of defeats the theory.
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, it's only gotten worse since then.
Since the 70s.
Yeah, since the 70s.
So there hasn't been a missing link transitionary thing found.
That's what I was going to say. Even not just the fossil record, but even like living things, you don't find like anything that's within a transition period that drastic that's being described as far as macroevolution. So it's even today, you don't see that process taking place.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's going to unfold like even more so as time goes on. It's like because with technology, how it's advanced, and it's like you can look at the fossil record and see that this isn't like that's not happening. So
that's fascinating. Now this might be a little of a curveball because we didn't talk about this before, but I was just was reminded of the punctuated equilibrium theory. Now, because in my mind, what Gould, because it was Dr. Gould, right, who came up with punctuated equilibrium.
Right, yeah. Punk-eek.
That whole theory, in my mind, is admitting that we're right about the fossil record.
Right, yeah.
Right, so do you want to explain a little bit about what that was?
So Dr. Gould and Dr. Eldridge had noticed, they're both paleontologists, they study fossils, and they both noticed that species appear suddenly in the fossil record, these new types of organisms. It's not always a species, but these, in fact, sometimes entire phyla, so this would be a major branch of new organisms, a new body plan, appears suddenly in the fossil record. And not only do they appear suddenly, but they remain the same for millions and millions of years, sometimes hundreds of millions of years.
So no small adaptation.
No.
Same.
Yeah,
same
exactly.
Species. Okay.
So it appears suddenly. In fact, the Darwinist, and he's also the director of evolutionary biology at the University of Reading, Dr. Mark Pagel, said in 1999, he says, "Paleobiologists, which are paleontologists, flock to these scientific visions of a world in a constant state of flux and admixture, constant changes. But instead of finding the slow, smooth, gradual changes that Lyell and Darwin had expected, instead they found in the fossil record rapid bursts of change. New species appearing seemingly out of nowhere and then remaining unchanged for millions of years. Patterns," he says, "patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation."
Wow.
Wow.
And he's a Darwinist.
But of course that can't be true.
Right, exactly. That's ridiculous. But that's where the evidence seems, at least it seems on the surface to indicate that. And so then they would say, well, we're going to have to look to another theory like punctuated equilibrium to try to explain why it is that the fossil record doesn't fit what Darwinian evolution would predict.
Okay, so for our viewers, what is punctuated equilibrium?
Okay,
What's the gist of the theory?
So the idea is that you can have these sort of background changes, these changes that don't show up in the organism for a long time, and then they suddenly are expressed. Now, that's a really interesting idea. Unfortunately, geneticists, for the most part, have said that doesn't fit with what we see in organisms. Like genetics would be the study of the building instructions in all of our bodies, and so those building instructions, the only way to change them is as they are being copied. You'd have to have like little errors creep in from time to time. And these are what are called mutations.
Okay.
And so the idea is that, these mutations would just sort of build up and then suddenly be expressed. And then others have tried to say, well, maybe it's the nature of the fossil record. It only fossilizes, for some reason, these transitions don't ever get fossilized. But all these attempts, they're really interesting, but they don't seem to... Yeah, they don't adequately explain what we observe.
No, so this is and you, because I haven't studied this as much, but correct me if I'm wrong with this. So Darwin said, "Here's my theory: slow change over time, millions of years, and that's how species change to different species, or genuses change to different genuses."
Right. Yeah.
Okay, and then we've observed the fossil record and we're not finding any evidence of that idea.
Yeah, sudden appearance and stasis is what we see instead.
So Gould comes along and says, okay, how do I fit Darwin's theory into the evidence I see?
Right.
And he makes up a story
I think so, yeah.
without evidence, saying what happens is things just change so rapidly we can't find them.
And there are some observations that can roughly fit with that, but it's really a stretch, I think. It's an attempt to save the theory.
Yeah, to save the theory in spite of the evidence.
yeah.
And so he makes up a story without evidence.
Yeah, for the most part, yes.
That's what's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So it's like, how's that science?
Yeah, absolutely. And
It's a myth.
Well, and like there are philosophers of science who've pointed this out, Thomas Kuhn and such. But anyway, that the problem is that there's always a desire to try to save your theory.
Sure.
And so there is a tendency in science to try to do that. But we need to have the freedom to let dissenting voices come in and say, this isn't fitting with what we observe, and be able to propose other explanations. Science moves forward with the freedom to be able to raise these alternative theories, like I would say, like intelligent design.
And to let go of things that have been disproven or don't have very much evidence, right? And that's the equilibrium, the punctuated equilibrium thing to me. I'm just like,
that's wild.
So if you're correct, if Gould is right about his theory of what's happening,
Right.
he couldn't know it through evidence.
Right. Yeah, pretty much. And because it explains away the evidence instead.
Exactly.
Now I do want to clarify that that I'm not saying there are no fossils that evolutionists ever point to that they claim are transitions. Certainly, evolutionists have, Darwinists have a lot of different fossils that they point to that they claim are transitions.
Okay.
But even if these transitional fossils turn out to be legitimate transitions, it's still nowhere near the countless number of transitions that we ought to find if Darwinian evolution is actually true.
Right.
Makes sense.
So even if we grant that those are legitimate transitions, like a transition from reptile to bird or a transition from fish to land animal, still that's nowhere near the number that we ought to find if the theory is actually
to
true.
explain the existence of every species.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
that makes a
exactly.
lot of sense. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I did see, this wasn't too long ago, right, where there was a publication about some kind of a dinosaur being fossilized that had feathers on it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And they point to that as this is a
Yeah.
transition to being dinosaurs went to birds as the theory.
That's the main theory.
Yeah.
Though there are dissenting voices within the evolutionary community who say, I don't think that birds came from dinosaurs.
Oh, okay.
So like Dr. Alan Fiducia, he's a biologist, he's a Darwinist, but he doesn't hold that birds came from dinosaurs.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not unanimous.
It's not unanimous, no.
That is interesting. I
That's
didn't know
very
that.
interesting.
In fact, it's
yeah.
helpful because he points out a lot of problems. Like, for example, a lot of Darwinists will say that Archaeopteryx is a transition from reptiles to birds, from dinosaurs to birds. But he points out we have fully formed birds in the fossil record long before Archaeopteryx ever shows up. So how is that a transition?
That's a good point.
So that, yeah. It's Darwin's theory was so clean cut, right? Like this, then it turns into this, then this, and this,
Right.
and it's a mess when you study it because you
Yeah.
have all of these different things around at the same time.
Exactly.
And then the other thing I've always thought was interesting is you have, if macroevolution is true, you have a certain populace of apes becoming Homo sapiens,
Right.
while
Yeah.
another group of apes remains ape.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? So what's the? I just don't know. I haven't heard the explanation for why species remain while some in their species have evolved.
So the idea would be that if you have a homogeneous population, so like they're all the same, you have these organisms, they're all basically the same, and then a portion of them then migrates or for some reason gets separated from the rest of the group, and now they're in a different environment.
Okay.
They're going to be under a different pressure. Natural selection is going to select out different features than the other group, so they can start to change differently.
I see. Okay.
So they have a way of trying to explain that. I think what's more problematic is the fact that when we look at these alleged transitions from early apes, from primates to humans, I think that the work of Dr. David Menton has shown that they fit nicely in either the human category or the ape category. That it's not this slow transition. Instead, what we see is there are clear diagnostic tools that we can use to tell which ones are apes and which ones are humans.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fascinating, man.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about because with the fossil record, the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
Right. There's so many great like YouTube videos and stuff out there on the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
What is it, and why is it important to the fossil record argument?
Right. Yeah. So this is at the very beginning of the fossil record, the really the first major fossil bearing layer. There's one minor layer below that, but the first major fossil bearing layer is the Cambrian layer, and in that layer we see the sudden appearance of a whole bunch of new organisms, and not just new organisms, but entirely new body plans. In fact, some have argued that most of the phyla, the major body plans that are in existence today, came about suddenly in a very small period of time near the beginning of the Cambrian period. So that's why it's called an explosion, because these organisms appear suddenly, almost explosively on the scene. Right. And so many people have pointed out, like, for example, Richard Barnes, who's a zoologist, and he's also a Darwinist. He holds to evolution. But he says, quote, most of the animal phyla that are represented in the fossil record first appear fully formed and identifiable as their phylum in the Cambrian some 550 million years ago. The fossil record is therefore of no help with respect to the origin and early diversification of various animal phyla.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So to put it like simply, there's layers of strata where we find fossils. And there's this Cambrian layer that's super old.
Yes.
And it's not just like in a, I remember when I was studying it originally, I thought it was just in one part of the world. That's not what they mean. Like this layer is in all parts of the world.
Yeah, it stretches in many, we see it in many different places.
Yeah, different continents even.
Right, yes.
Yeah. And so when you dig down, you find these fossilized animal remains, and it's just like everything's there. And the crazy part is the layer of strata prior has what in it?
So the layer prior to that is the Ediacaran fauna, which is basically like we're not entirely sure what they are. They seem to be underwater organisms that are kind of like jellyfish, sort of, and it's a variety of different types. Yeah. But what's really interesting is they bear almost no resemblance, pretty much no resemblance to what we see in the Cambrian explosion.
Wow. So there's so below the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion, there's all these animal, different types, body structures, everything.
Right.
Below it, there's like these little jellyfish things.
Yeah, kind of pillowy looking organisms.
And between them, no transition.
Right. Yeah.
So it's almost like one little thing, and then boom, everything.
Right.
Explosion.
Yeah. All the major groups. And keep in mind that if evolution is true, if Darwinian evolution is true, we ought to see at the origin of life one type of organism, and then over time they become more and more different. So really it's only toward the end of the fossil record, more recently, that we ought to see like very big differences. Instead, this takes that model and flips it on its head. Instead, the very different body plans, completely different ways of constructing an organism appear at the very beginning. And actually then just continue on. Okay. So that's why some Darwinists even describe the fossil record as demonstrating, rather than a tree of life, more like a lawn, because these things just appear and they go straight up.
Wow. Okay.
That sort of thing.
Interesting. And in the Cambrian layer, there's animals that we find fossilized that are extinct now.
Yes. Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You'd expect to find more diversity presently.
Right, yes.
But we don't. We find more diversity at the beginning.
Yes.
And less.
That's interesting.
Well, we even know animals go extinct, right? So
Right,
you have
yeah.
extinction happening.
Yep.
But it seems backwards to the theory.
Yeah, what we would expect, I think. And you can expect extinction events, that sort of thing. But that would just be a branch that ends and then another branch gets taller, that sort of thing. But yeah, to have all the major body plans, all these major differences, the major structural differences appear at the very beginning.
Yeah.
This is kind of the opposite of what Darwinian evolution would predict.
And that's what the evidence shows.
That's what the evidence shows, yeah.
And so this isn't thus saith Genesis 1.
Right, yeah.
Right.
So we haven't really
Science.
made reference to the Bible in any of these arguments, yeah.
And because you don't, I believe the Bible's true.
Yeah.
Right? But you don't need to. You can say, let's just look at the evidence that's here, because the evidence should speak for itself. God reveals himself through what's real.
Yes.
And the fossil record's real.
Yeah, yeah,
and we can know
absolutely.
him from that, and we can know and put together the past through studying. So, man, I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is you just think like through time, like how this is going to affect Darwinists in the future, like with the
Right.
theory, and because as we progress, you know, like there's going to be more and more evidence countering it as long as
Right.
like you're not seeing those changes take place, and it's like they're going to have to keep growing and adapting these arguments if they're going to keep it alive.
Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing.
The only problem would be is if you find ways philosophically to exclude intelligent design, then what other option do you have but Darwinism? It's kind of the only option out there. And so I think we do see that at an institutional level, you know, in schools and universities where no other alternative is really allowed. And so now there are conferences that have been popping up where Darwinists are now saying we need to rethink the mechanism.
Yeah.
How Darwinism actually goes about. Is it through mutation and natural selection, like we've thought since for a long time now, or are there some other mechanisms we need to try to explore? But notice all along, what's assumed is Darwinian evolution.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's a non-negotiable. But we can rethink the mechanism. Well, if it's not a mechanism, I mean, evolution at its base is a mechanism.
Yeah.
That's what it
yeah.
is. It's a mechanism and a story of history, a historical account. So without the mechanism, without the how it happened, that's primarily what it is. It's trying to explain how we got the diversity of life on Earth.
Yeah.
So basically, they're rethinking the foundation of this entire theory, but you can never actually question the conclusion.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So the
too-
conclusion is
yeah.
true, but the theory may be wrong. It makes zero sense. I even heard Richard Dawkins is talking about like possible aliens.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And
Yeah.
that's where he's
Yeah,
at
yeah.
with this, and he's an evolutionary biologist, right?
But if you assume that science cannot move forward unless you exclude any sort of intelligence, that it has to be purely natural processes. Well, then you come to those kind of conclusions. Well, if it turns out that you need something to create life on Earth, if you need well, then it must have been an alien life form that itself evolved. So
Sure.
That's why
Yeah.
he's stuck in that corner, because he's already said that he can't even consider explanations that involve an ultimate intelligence.
Because he's already philosophically decided a supernatural, godlike being can't exist.
Yes.
Not based on evidence, but just based on this is my
And
view.
he says that science won't work without that assumption. I don't think
Which
that's
that doesn't
true.
even make sense. Yeah, I don't agree with that
Right.
at all. That's very interesting. Well, but even his argument of, alien that evolved, it's lack of evidence.
Right.
So
yeah.
that's another
An
that's what
argument
we
from
call-
ignorance.
That's what we say. Nice story, bro.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Or it's called mythology.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But also it just kicks the can back in time a little bit.
Right,
It doesn't
right.
answer the question. It just moves it backwards to and then way long ago this happened over there. Well,
Right.
how do you explain that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say too. I've met an atheist before who I talked to about this. Who he actually had said this was several years ago, but he had actually told me, he's like, I don't actually believe that macroevolution is true. But he's like, but he said, he's like, I don't believe in intelligent design. But he's like, his thing that he said, he was like, I just think that there's no actual way that we can know that it happens. And to me, that's a cop out.
Right.
But the thing is what the reason I bring that up is because I feel like to a certain degree, if you don't come up with a different answer, you're going to have to say something like that. If you're trying to exclude intelligent design and then exclude macroevolution, and then you're going to have to go with aliens, it's like
it's either intelligent design or it's natural processes.
that's what I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then remain a perpetual skeptic's not a position.
I mean, this is an example that the philosopher Greg Kokel brings up. But he said, imagine if I came to you and I said, hey, I have something in a beaker and I need you to explain like where it came from. Like, okay, yeah, I'll do my scientific analysis. Mm-hmm. Okay, here it is. And he hands you the beaker and in it is an Oreo cookie. You're like, I can explain where that came from. It was, designed, it was made. And he goes, oh, no. You're not allowed to conclude intelligent design. You have to use natural processes. That intelligent design is outside of the rules of science. Well, now all of a sudden you're like, well, I could come up with some like confounded explanation.
Sure.
It'll be a little messy, but I can come up with an explanation of how like a cocoa plant, tipped over and there's a sugar cane plant nearby and lightning struck. I mean, you can come up with all sorts of stuff, but really the best explanation is intelligent design.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You can you could come up with some ideas.
Yeah.
And then if it's double stuffed, you could get into that. Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
That's very interesting. So the fossil record, I think, kind of condemns the Darwinian evolutionary model, right?
I think so, yeah.
What's another thing? Like there's homology, there's mutations, right? What do you think is another really good argument that is against macroevolution?
Yeah, so I'd say when we look at the nature of mutations, like you mentioned, I think that actually causes serious problems for Darwinism. So it turns out that as far as we've ever been able to observe, when mutations actually make a change, a noticeable change, mutations break things, they don't make things. I think that's really important to keep in mind. Mutations break things, they don't make things. So there are neutral mutations, ones that don't really show up. You don't really see like what difference it made. But when a mutation makes a difference, it tends to break the organism or a part of the organism rather than making some new structure.
Okay.
And so if we were ever going to observe mutations creating new structures, it would be in bacteria. Bacteria turn out to be the perfect place to try to observe evolution in action, to try to observe mutations creating new structures, because bacteria reproduce so often. In the lab, we can cultivate a new generation of E. coli every 20 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
it's like a fast forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So in one human lifetime, we can observe about 2 million generations of E. coli.
Whoa.
So that's like observing a large chunk of, basically observing the history of human evolution within one human lifetime.
Okay.
And keep in mind that bacteria mutate at a higher rate, so they actually change more often.
Oh.
So we really ought to observe it in bacteria. But it turns out that when we observe bacteria, we don't see those sorts of changes, mutations creating new structures. So for example, Dr. Richard Lenski in his lab, he's been cultivating generations of E. coli. He's been growing E. coli in his lab for the last 30 years. Everyone's got to have a hobby, right? That's his hobby. And he's doing it on purpose, too. It's not like the cleaning lady like skipped his office for the last 30 years, So
intentional. That's good.
So he's been observing these for the last 30 years, trying to see what kind of changes we see. And he even subjects them to selective pressure, not enough nutrients or whatever to see if they'll adapt to these new conditions.
But that's not intelligent.
Well, yeah, I mean...
That gets a little dicey,
it's
right?
It's kind of, simulation, but yeah, it is.
Simulation, okay, that's fair.
But there are places where Dr. Lenski's experiments do kind of smack of intelligent design a little bit. There are places. But here's the point. He still has not observed these mutations creating new structures.
Wow.
And so that's amazing.
Wow.
Even after 30 years of this ongoing experiment, what he sees is a lot of mutations that break existing structures, mutations that switch on genes that were already there, structures that were already there. But what we don't see is these mutations creating new structures.
That's fascinating.
And so that's even in E. coli.
Are you telling me that the X-Men can't be real?
Is
that where you're getting at with all of this?
I'm sorry, yeah.
It doesn't bring superhuman strength. It actually breaks down? Oh,
so,
man.
Okay, total aside, but you know the character Rogue?
Yeah.
So if her power came about, this is a total but if her power came about through a mutation, how does she steal the powers of other people?
That's a great question.
Does she take their mutations? Anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That's a
totally
great question.
nerdy question.
It's a great story.
They do
but
call her a
just
mutant,
doesn't
so that's
work.
strange.
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, all the X-Men, with maybe the exclusion of Wolverine, are mutants. Like, he was intelligently designed, right?
Oh yeah, that's right. Well, partially.
No,
partially.
he had his bones still, but they
well,
put
no,
metal
but
in him.
they did it to him.
Yeah, you're
it
right.
didn't just
Yeah.
happen magically
Yeah.
through mutation. So I find that fascinating. But that's what even it's really interesting. Even like the Planet of the Apes movies were based on Darwinian evolution.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Except, have you seen the newer ones?
I haven't. No.
This is fascinating to me. and I don't know who made this judgment call, but in the newer ones, I think James Franco's
He's in the first of the
scientist in
three.
it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They don't teach evolution.
Really?
The first ape, Caesar, he becomes like he becomes because of intelligent design.
Oh,
because
like
they were
a
working
science
on this
experiment.
science
It was a freak
thing. Yeah,
experiment.
it was a science
Accident,
experiment that
yeah.
went wrong. So again, that's not evolution. It's fascinating
Yeah.
to me. So I'm like, man, even Hollywood's seeing, we can't sell this anymore. In the 70s, it was okay, but now we
Yeah,
gotta-
right.
which I thought was interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So the mutation thing, it makes, again, from a not from such a micro level of looking at mutations in genes, but just the way the rest of the world works. What's the law? Everything's going from a state of order to disorder.
Right.
Is that what you're saying happens in gene mutation?
So typically people will point to the second law of thermodynamics, and really that's more about energy transfer. But yeah, I mean, as a general rule, we do see that things tend to go from order to disorder. It's because it's a general rule, it's harder to use that as evidence. But yeah,
Sure.
I think it does seem to, it ought to be counterintuitive to us. It ought to at least make us question the theory, because it really seems to be going in the opposite direction of what we tend to observe in nature.
The evidence is it's not getting better and fixing itself or transitioning.
Right.
It's breaking down.
Like we observe with mutations, yeah.
Man, that's very interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. So again, Darwin maybe not right
Yeah.
on this one. I wonder, and again, this you can never know what he would have done in light of the evidence we have nowadays, right?
Right.
But you wonder, like, if he knew what the fossil record was like that we've discovered now, if he knew about mutations, because he didn't even know like what the cell. He thought that was the building block of life, right?
Well, yeah, and so he actually at that time in the 1850s, they really thought of the cell as like a blob of protoplasm, this sort of like gelatinous blob. And so what we've discovered since then is actually each cell, whether we're talking about prokaryotic cells, these very simple cells, simple, I put quotes around that, or even the eukaryotic cells, which are far more complex, we still see that both are highly advanced. I mean, these are, I think Dr. Michael Denton, who's a microbiologist, he described even the most simple single cell as far more complicated than any machine ever built by man.
That's crazy.
So that includes things like the space shuttle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And so he describes it as a city, like a working city where you have factories and you have delivery systems.
Yeah.
And this is what we observe.
And that's what's going on in each cell.
Each cell, yeah, microscopic cell.
And Darwin, again, because he's a product of his time, and he the science of where he was at, not at any fault of his own. That's where he was though.
Right.
But he basically thought that the cell was basically like a Lego.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a building block of what we're made of.
Right.
Not
yeah.
that there's this whole city inside of it operating and doing things and DNA and
Yeah.
yeah. So
exactly.
sometimes I do wonder like what he would think of his theory if he had the ideas and the evidence that we have nowadays.
I do
we
wonder
can't
that,
know,
yeah.
but
Yeah, it's interesting.
it's interesting to think about. Yeah.
He definitely seemed to be more humble about his theory than many Darwinists today. And I would like to. That's not to paint with a broad brush. There are many Darwinists who are rather humble about their theory. But I'd say what we often observe is a certainty that it has to be true, and an unwillingness to even question the major assumptions. And that I think is a dangerous position for anyone. We end up being unwilling to critically examine our view if we're not willing to read the work of those who criticize us and really analyze it and say, well, maybe they're onto something.
Yeah. Well, so what do you think the appeal is of Darwinism? Because if it's not the strength of the evidence, why are so many people holding on to it like it's the gospel truth?
Right. I think part of it is assumptions that creation must mean that all species, every single, like even dog breeds, have to all appear suddenly on Earth. Okay. There are a lot of assumptions about what creation means, and so they go, well, it can't be that. Also, I think that there are a lot of assumptions about how science has to work, that it has to be a natural explanation. As soon as we start to see, well, no, science doesn't. You can observe. You have to observe natural phenomena. You have to observe natural things, and the processes that you're mostly going to appeal to are going to be these natural processes. But as far as what the ultimate causes are, I don't see any reason why you have to assume that it had to be natural processes.
Sure.
You basically end up deciding a huge worldview question in advance, a priori, before you even come to the evidence. So, so I think that's a lot of the appeal.
Well, and how can they assume that standing on the giants of Christian scientists throughout history? Most of the best science that has ever come about has been through Christian men. Newton, Copernicus, Galileo. I mean, on and on and on.
Yes.
It's like you can do science while believing in Christianity.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's such an interesting stance for them to take. I don't know.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, that's weird. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I asked you a big question. Why do people do what they do?
Right.
Tell me,
Let me
man.
read their minds. No, it is always tough because we want to assume the best of people that we disagree with. And so, but, there are a lot of assumptions that are unquestioned, unfortunately.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, I also like a point you made earlier too. It's just dangerous to have that kind of mindset with any worldview. It's not even just in evolution and like with having flaws, like just to have this thing of it must happen, like without like that determination to make it. That's just a dangerous mindset to live in, even for Christians. Because the thing is, if you aren't exploring and looking at what you believe and the process of how you get to that conclusion, you could be wrong and then not ever investigate and know.
Absolutely.
It's just a dangerous mindset.
Yeah.
Well, it's closed-minded.
It is closed-minded.
Right? I've often thought that, like, is the Christian the closed-minded one, or are we the open-minded one, saying, look, there's might
other
be a
possibilities.
supernatural too.
Right.
You know what I mean? Is
Yeah.
it to say no, there's no supernatural, or say, hey, there could be?
So on the Christian or even just the generally theistic, a view that basically holds to God, whether it's Christian or Muslim or whatever, at least it's open to more causal entities, more possible causes.
Yeah.
Whereas a naturalistic view, a view that says natural causes are the only kind of causes that we're going to allow for, this actually closes the door on several, at least philosophically possible options. So it seems that it would be safer to go with a theistic assumption, a Christian, if you will, assumption, so that as you're approaching science, so that at least you can, or at least not close the door on that, so that you can be open to other possibilities.
Yeah.
Right.
And go wherever the evidence leads.
Wherever the evidence leads, right?
Yeah. And well, in the same way, I was going to say, like, I'm open-minded about evolution, macroevolution happening.
Sure.
It just, there's not enough evidence to compel me to believe that right now. And you see, that's like the type of mindset that we should have, right? About these things. Exactly. It's like, you should be open-minded about all possibilities, right?
Yeah.
Right. And that doesn't mean you believe in all possibilities.
But you're open to them.
Yeah, you're open to them. And you consider, okay, well, there's a likelihood generations or years from now that I could be proven wrong.
Yeah.
Sure.
But I mean, as you got to go off of what you're given right now.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. And that's the thing.
And I think too that a lot of people make the assumption. I don't know if the evolutionist thinks this, but if evolution's true, if Darwin's theory is proven, right, with beyond a shadow of a doubt, we all have to go, yeah, okay, that's right. Which, again, how much evidence would that take? Tons. Like, I don't know if we'll... I don't think we could find that much evidence in our lifetime. But let's just say it is. If evolution is proved, it doesn't disprove Christianity.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't think evolution's true because I don't find evidence for it.
Right.
If it was proven to be true, I might have to change my hermeneutic on Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
But would it mean Jesus didn't rise from the dead? No.
No, yeah.
And I think sometimes Christians get afraid of that. Well, if evolution's true, then Christianity's wrong. No, it's not.
Yeah.
We're not, I'm not willing to give that away. Like,
Right.
it's not. It doesn't mean anything. It just means my preconceptions of how God did things are different.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't believe in evolution because I find no evidence for it.
Right.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think we need to think like that. Like, what has to happen for Christianity to be true, right? What are we fighting for here? What's real, and what evidence do we have for Jesus' resurrection and what he taught and all these things? But at the same time, I think Darwinian evolution is just a very bad model.
Yeah. I think you're
Based
right.
on fossil record, based on mutations, based on a lot of things.
Right. Yeah.
Especially when their scientists have to make up counter theories because they're not finding the evidence they have to have for the theory to work.
Yeah.
Like punctuated equilibrium. It cracks me up, man. Sometimes I'll just start laughing when I think about you had to make up a new story because your story doesn't hold water. Like,
Right.
very interesting, you know? I can't find I can't find good evidence that's very compelling for that worldview. It seems to me, and again, you don't want to paint with a broad brush, but just historically what was happening was when Darwin came along with a new mechanism for the origin of life, a lot of the people who were deists could finally jump ship from a god
Right.
and say, we're left on our own, we can do whatever we want.
Yeah. Well, Darwin was a deist, correct?
Yeah, and to his credit, he did kind of distance himself from the origin of life question, though in some personal letters he did, sort of speculate about that. But what's interesting is if you're going to take that same methodology that only natural explanations are allowed, well, then you're going to end up needing a natural explanation for the origin of life too.
Exactly.
So it basically ends up resulting in the same thing.
Yeah, it's just fascinating. And so, yeah. Man, this is awesome. I love talking about this kind of stuff.
It's critical.
Right.
I mean, where we came from is one of the most essential questions that we can ponder.
It is, Yep. And now what's interesting is the evidence we're finding in the fossil record, the evidence in mutations actually backs up a theistic worldview.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
Which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
A God who made everything, and now things are going extinct and dying off. That's what the Cambrian explosion shows, right?
Right, yeah.
Mutations, right? That there was a beginning, and now everything's kind of fanning out, and mutations aren't working, and there's disruption.
Kind of devolving. Yeah.
Devolving. That seems to be what Scripture talks about with the onslaught of sin. Right, and the fall, and even the breaking of the natural realm in a sense, right, and that it's groaning, and childbirth, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, and all that seems, in my estimation, to be what's going on.
Yeah,
it makes sense of reality, and that's what I think's awesome about the Bible. I never have to be afraid of studying science.
Right. Yeah.
Because truth will always back itself up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if it turns out that science definitively showed, if we had really good reason to think that the essential Christian doctrines were false, well, then I'd want to know that. I'd want to know if Christianity is not true. So I think we should never be afraid of the evidence and the truth, because we ought to seek the truth.
Yep.
And it's because I think that Christianity is really true that's why I trust in God, and that's why I see that it's really true that He did these things for me in history, that He ultimately came to earth as Jesus of Nazareth, that He died on the cross and paid for our sins and rose from the dead historically. It's because of those things that I know that I can put my trust in God.
Yep. Yeah. It's awesome, man. I love what you said. If it wasn't true, I'd really like to know it. I'm kind of like banking on it. Setting everything up for it. So, I agree with that. We should follow truth wherever it leads.
Yeah.
Even if we want our theory to be right.
Right.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we shouldn't. Nope. I'd rather follow what's real. So That's awesome, man. Well, James, thanks so much for being on today.
Thank you
been
so
fun.
much. This was great.
So if people want to find out more about you, your ministry, what you're doing, where can they go?
Right. Yeah. So I'd recommend two places. One is if you'd like to find out about Ratio Christi, if you know students out there at ASU Tempe, just check us out on Facebook and on Instagram. We're at Ratio Christi ASU Tempe. And then for some of the stuff specifically regarding the ministry work that I do, check out Examined Life. So it's examined-life.org.
Awesome. And we'll put links to all that in the show notes so you can find it really quick. One note about that. Spotify doesn't have show note link capability. So we put it in there, but you have to type it out like it was 1995. But if you go on iTunes or if you go on YouTube, the links work. And so just to help you out with that, you Spotify people.
There you go.
That'll be awesome. Definitely go check out what he's doing and all his ministries. And you guys have got a ton of good stuff going on. Especially in this regard. I think that this is a big deal, and it's a big question people have. Even with high school students, man, they're always asking about what's the deal with evolution?
Yeah.
How can I trust what the Bible says in regards to origins?
I mean, think about it this way. 5 days out of the week, these students are hearing evolution is a fact. Evolution, and by evolution, I mean Darwinian evolution. It's a fact. It's a fact from someone who's an expert in the sciences. Maybe one day out of the week, they hear a pastor say, I don't think evolution is really true.
Yeah.
What's going to pull more weight for a student? I think we need to have these sorts of resources, and we need to talk about these sorts of things, because just saying, well, I don't believe in evolution and you shouldn't either, is not going to counteract all the what appears to be evidence that they're given 5 days a week.
Sure. Yep. Yeah, strong stories have power, right?
Yeah.
And if you're bombarded with it over and over and over again, it can be compelling, or it can just get annoying and you give into it.
Yeah.
Sometimes that happens too. So anyway, well, man, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much. This
Really
was
excited
a
about
lot
it.
of fun.
It was
Just
a lot of fun.
Good.
diving into this topic.
This is fun. Yeah, this is an honor to be on the program.
Oh, yeah. Anytime. You can come in, we'll buy you coffee and we'll hang out. So, hey, thanks so much for being with us today on Christ Culture and Coffee. Make sure to follow us on our Instagram. Make sure to become a Christ Culture and Coffee Insider on Facebook. We've been having a lot of people asking to be on that. Now, if you're asking to be on the Insiders group, you have to leave us a review on iTunes or a review on Facebook first, or we won't let you in. So make sure you do that. But then also check out what James is doing at Ratio Christi ASU, Tempe. Also check out Examined Life and everything that's going on there. But make sure you're back with us next week as we have another interview that's coming up with an atheist, not a former atheist, with an actual atheist. So you're not going to want to miss that. And also, our 100th episode is coming up. We're 2 weeks out from that.
Yes, and that is going to be a big deal. Obviously, you know we've been talking about this over and over at the beginning of our videos and podcasts. We really want you to know that this episode, it's going to be a big event as we announce the winners of the giveaway.
Yep.
And we just have a lot planned for that episode. It's going to be a lot of fun, and you definitely want to be there.
Yep. Make sure you go on Instagram or Facebook and enter into the giveaway, because the top prize is a whole bunch of stuff, but also a coffee date with Tyler and myself. Who doesn't want that?
Who
right?
doesn't want that?
No, I saw one of our friends, actually, he's in Canada. He's like, well, I hope I don't get first, because that would mean nothing to me. Not because he wasn't like, but he was saying, I can't come to Arizona.
Right.
Listen, we'll Skype coffee date you. We'll do Zoom.
We will
something.
do what we
Yeah,
have to do
we
to
don't care
get
about
you
that.
connected with us.
Yeah,
It'll
exactly.
work.
So even if you don't live here, we
Yes.
can get together and we'll send you a coffee card. You can buy coffee. We'll buy coffee, and we'll cyber coffee date together.
Yeah, and with that, just make sure you're looking at our Instagram and our Facebook accounts, just that way you can see updates on our 100th episode coming out, because we're going to be unpacking more details of what is going to be stored in that episode, and you really don't want to miss it. So make sure you stay tuned for that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, James, thanks again, man, for being
thank
here
you
today.
so much.
This was awesome. And thank you, our listeners and viewers, for being with us today on Christ Culture and Coffee. We'll see you guys again next week.